Colonel Aureliano Buendía organized 32 armed uprisings, and he lost them all. He had 17 male children by 17 different women, and they were exterminated one after the other on a single night, before the oldest one had reached the age of 35. He survived 14 attempts on his life, 73 ambushes, and a firing squad. He lived through a dose of strychnine in his coffee that was enough to kill a horse. He refused the Order of Merit, which the President of the Republic awarded him. He rose to be Commander-in-Chief of the Revolutionary Forces, with jurisdiction and command from one border to the other, and the man most feared by the government. But he never let himself be photographed. He declined the lifetime pension offered him after the war, and until old age he made his living from the little gold fishes that he manufactured in his workshop in Macondo. Although he always fought at the head of his men, the only wound that he received was the one he gave himself after signing the Treaty of Neerlandia, which put an end to almost 20 years of civil war. He shot himself in the chest with a pistol, and the bullet came out through his back without damaging any vital organ. The only thing left of all that was a street that bore his name in Macondo, and yet, as he declared a few years before he died of old age, he had not expected any of that on the dawn he left with his 21 men to join the forces of General Victorio Medina. "We leave Macondo in your care," was all that he said to Arcadio before leaving. "We leave it to you in good shape. Try to have it in better shape when we return." Arcadio gave a very personal interpretation to the instructions. He invented a uniform with the braid and epaulets of a marshal, inspired by the prince in one of Melquiades' books, and around his waist he buckled the sabre with gold tassels that had belonged to the executed captain. He set up the 2 artillery pieces at the entrance to town, put uniforms on his former pupils, who had been aroused by his fiery proclamations, and let them wander through the streets armed in order to give outsiders an impression of invulnerability. It was a double-edged deception, for the government did not dare attack the place for 10 months. But when it did, it unleashed such a large force against it that resistance was liquidated in a half-hour. From the first day of his rule, Arcadio revealed his predilection for decrees. He would read as many as 4 a day in order to decree and institute everything that came into his head. He imposed obligatory military service for men over 18, declared to be public property any animals walking the streets after 6 in the evening, and made men who were over age wear red armbands. He sequestered Father Nicanor in the parish house, under pain of execution, and prohibited him from saying Mass or ringing the bells unless it was for a liberal victory. In order that no one would doubt the severity of his aims, he ordered a firing squad organized in the square and had it shoot at a scarecrow. At first, no one took him seriously. They were, after all, school children, playing at being grown-ups. But one night, when Arcadio went into Caterino's store, the trumpeter in the group greeted him with a fanfare that made the customers laugh, and Arcadio had him shot for disrespect for the authorities. People who protested were put on bread and water with their ankles in a set of stocks that he had set up in a schoolroom. "You murderer!" Ursula would shout at him every time she learned of some new arbitrary act. "When Aureliano finds out he's going to shoot you, and I'll be the first one to be glad." But it was of no use. Arcadio continued tightening the tourniquet with unnecessary rigor until he became the cruelest ruler that Macondo had ever known. "Now let them suffer the difference," Don Apolinar Mascote said on one occasion. "This is the liberal paradise." Arcadio found out about it. At the head of a patrol he assaulted the house, destroyed the furniture, flogged the daughters, and dragged out Don Apolinar Mascote. When Ursula burst into the courtyard of headquarters, after having gone through the town shouting shame and brandishing with rage a pitch-covered whip, Arcadio himself was preparing to give the squad the command to fire. "I dare you to, bastard!" Ursula shouted. Before Arcadio had time to react, she let go with the first blow of the lash. "I dare you to, murderer!" she shouted, "and kill me too, son of an evil mother. That way I won't have the eyes to weep for the shame of having raised a monster." Whipping him without mercy, she chased him to the back of the courtyard, where Arcadio curled up like a snail in its shell. Don Apolinar Moscote was unconscious, tied to the post where previously they had had the scarecrow that had been cut to pieces by shots fired in fun. The boys in the squad scattered, fearful that Ursula would go after them too, but she did not even look at them. She left Arcadio with his uniform torn, roaring with pain and rage, and she untied Don Apolinar Moscote and took him home. Before leaving the headquarters, she released the prisoners from the stocks. From that time on, she was the one who ruled in the town. She re-established Sunday Mass, suspended the use of red armbands, and abrogated the hair-brained decrees. But in spite of her strength, she still wept over her unfortunate fate. She felt so much alone that she sought the useless company of her husband, who had been forgotten under the chestnut tree. "Look what we've come to," she would tell him as the June rains threatened to knock the shelter down. "Look at the empty house, our children scattered all over the world, and the two of us alone again, the same as in the beginning." José Arcadio Buendía, sunk in an abyss of unawareness, was deaf to her lamentations. At the beginning of his madness he would announce his daily needs with urgent Latin phrases. In fleeting, clear spells of lucidity, when Amaranta would bring him his meals, he would tell her what bothered him most, and would accept her sucking glasses and mustard plasters in a docile way. But at the time when Ursula went to lament by his side, he had lost all contact with reality. She would bathe him bit by bit, as he sat on his stool, while she gave him news of the family. "Aureliano went to war more than 4 months ago, and we haven't heard anything about him," she would say, scrubbing his back with a soaped brush. "José Arcadio came back a big man, taller than you, and all covered with needlework, but he only brought shame to our house." She thought she noticed, however, that her husband would grow sad with the bad news. Then she decided to lie to him. "You won't believe what I'm going to tell you," she said, as she threw ashes over his excrement in order to pick it up with the shovel. "God willed that José Arcadio and Rebecca should get married, and now they're very happy." She got to be so sincere in the deception that she ended up by consoling herself with her own lies. "Arcadio is a serious man now," she said, "and very brave, and a fine-looking young man with his uniform and sabre." It was like speaking to a dead man, for José Arcadio Buendía was already beyond the reach of any worry. But she insisted. He seemed so peaceful, so indifferent to everything, that she decided to release him. He did not even move from his stool. He stayed there, exposed to the sun and the rain, as if the thongs were unnecessary, for a dominion superior to any visible bond kept him tied to the trunk of the chestnut tree. Toward August, when winter began to last forever, Ursula was finally able to give him a piece of news that sounded like the truth. "Would you believe it, that good luck is still pouring down on us?" she told him. "Amaranta and the pianola Italian are going to get married." Amaranta and Pietro Crespi had, in fact, deepened their friendship, protected by Ursula, who this time did not think it necessary to watch over the visits. It was a twilight engagement. The Italian would arrive at dusk, with a gardenia in his buttonhole, and he would translate Petrarch's sonnets for Amaranta. They would sit on the porch, suffocated by the oregano and the roses, he reading and she sewing lace cuffs, indifferent to the shocks and bad news of the war, until the mosquitoes made them take refuge in the parlour. Amaranta's sensibility, her discreet but enveloping tenderness, had been weaving an invisible web about her fiancé, which he had to push aside materially with his pale and ringless fingers in order to leave the house at 8 o'clock. They had put together a delightful album with the postcards that Pietro Crespi received from Italy. They were pictures of lovers in lonely parks, with vignettes of hearts pierced with arrows and golden ribbons held by doves. "I've been to this park in Florence," Pietro Crespi would say, going through the cards. "A person can put out his hand and the birds will come to feed." Sometimes, over a watercolour of Venice, nostalgia would transform the smell of mud and putrefying shellfish of the canals into the warm aroma of flowers. Amaranta would sigh, laugh, and dream of a second homeland of handsome men and beautiful women who spoke a childlike language, with ancient cities, of whose past grandeur only the cats among the rubble remained. After crossing the ocean in search of it, after having confused passion with the vehement stroking of Rebecca, Pietro Crespi had found love. Happiness was accompanied by prosperity. His warehouse at that time occupied almost a whole block, and it was a hothouse of fantasy, with reproductions of the bell tower of Florence that told time with a concert of carillons, and music boxes from Sorrento and compacts from China that sang five-note melodies when they were opened, and all the musical instruments imaginable, and all the mechanical toys that could be conceived. Bruno Crespi, his younger brother, was in charge of the store because Pietro Crespi barely had enough time to take care of the music school. Thanks to him, the Street of the Turks, with its dazzling display of knickknacks, became a melodic oasis, where one could forget Arcadio's arbitrary acts and the distant nightmare of the war. When Ursula ordered the revival of Sunday Mass, Pietro Crespi donated a German harmonium to the church, organized a children's chorus, and prepared a Gregorian repertory that added a note of splendor to Father Nicanor's quiet rite. No one doubted that he would make Amaranta a fortunate mate. Not pushing their feelings, letting themselves be borne along by the natural flow of their hearts, they reached a point where all that was left to do was set a wedding date. They did not encounter any obstacles. Ursula accused herself inwardly of having twisted Rebecca's destiny with repeated postponements, and she was not about to add more remorse. The rigour of the mourning for Remedios had been relegated to the background by the mortifications of the war, Aureliano's absence, Arcadio's brutality, and the expulsion of Jose Arcadio and Rebecca. With the imminence of the wedding, Pietro Crespi had hinted that Aureliano Jose, in whom he had stirred up a love that was almost filial, would be considered their oldest child. Everything made Amaranta think that she was heading toward a smooth happiness. But unlike Rebecca, she did not reveal the slightest anxiety. With the same patience with which she dyed tablecloths, sewed lace masterpieces, and embroidered needlepoint peacocks, she waited for Pietro Crespi to be unable to bear the urges of his heart and more. Her day came with the ill-fated October rains. Pietro Crespi took the sewing basket from her lap and told her, "We'll get married next month." Amaranta did not tremble at the contact with his icy hands. She withdrew hers like a timid little animal and went back to her work. "Don't be simple, Crespi," she smiled. "I wouldn't marry you even if I were dead." Pietro Crespi lost control of himself. He wept shamelessly, almost breaking his fingers with desperation. But he could not break her down. "Don't waste your time," was all that Amaranta said. "If you really love me so much, don't set foot in this house again." Ursula thought she would go mad with shame. Pietro Crespi exhausted all manner of pleas. He went through incredible extremes of humiliation. He wept one whole afternoon in Ursula's lap, and she would have sold her soul in order to comfort him. On rainy nights he could be seen prowling about the house with an umbrella, waiting for a light in Amaranta's bedroom. He was never better dressed than at that time. His august head of a tormented emperor had acquired a strange air of grandeur. He begged Amaranta's friends, the ones who sewed with her on the porch, to try to persuade her. He neglected his business. He would spend the day in the rear of the store writing wild notes, which he would send to Amaranta with flower petals and dried butterflies, and which she would return unopened. He would shut himself up for hours on end to play the zither. One night he sang. Macondo woke up in a kind of angelic stupor that was caused by a zither that deserved more than this world, and a voice that led one to believe that no other person on earth could feel such love. Pietro Crespi then saw the lights go on in every window in town, except that of Amaranta. On November 2nd, All Souls' Day, his brother opened the store and found all the lamps lighted, all the music boxes opened, and all the clocks striking an interminable hour, and in the midst of that mad concert he found Pietro Crespi at the desk in the rear, with his wrists cut by a razor, and his hands thrust into a basin of benzoin. Ursula decreed that the wake would be in her house. Father Nicanor was against a religious ceremony and burial in consecrated ground. Ursula stood up to him, "In a way that neither you nor I can understand. That man was a saint," she said, "so I am going to bury him against your wishes, beside Melchiades' grave." She did it with the support of the whole town and with a magnificent funeral. Amaranta did not leave her bedroom. From her bed she heard Ursula's weeping, the steps and whispers of the multitude that invaded the house, the wailing of the mourners, and then a deep silence that smelled of trampled flowers. For a long time she kept on smelling Pietro Crespi's lavender breath at dusk, but she had the strength not to succumb to delirium. Ursula abandoned her. She did not even raise her eyes to pity her on the afternoon when Amaranta went into the kitchen and put her hand into the coals of the stove until it hurt her so much that she felt no more pain, but instead smelled the pestilence of her own singed flesh. It was a stupid cure for her remorse. For several days she went about the house with her hand in a pot of egg whites, and when the burns healed, it appeared as if the whites had also scarred over the sores on her heart. The only external trace that the tragedy left was the bandage of black gauze that she put on her burned hand, and that she wore until her death. Arcadio gave a rare display of generosity by decreeing official mourning for Pietro Crespi. Ursula interpreted it as the return of the strayed lamb, but she was mistaken. She had lost Arcadio, not when he had put on his military uniform, but from the beginning. She thought she had raised him as a son, as she had raised Rebecca, with no privileges or discrimination. Nevertheless, Arcadio was a solitary and frightened child during the insomnia plague, in the midst of Ursula's utilitarian fervour, during the delirium of José Arcadio Buendía, the hermetism of Aureliano, and the mortal rivalry between Amaranta and Rebecca. Aureliano had taught him to read and write, thinking about other things, as he would have done with a stranger. He gave him his clothing so that Visitación could take it in when it was ready to be thrown away. Arcadio suffered from shoes that were too large, from his patched pants, from his female buttocks. He never succeeded in communicating with anyone better than he did with Visitación and Cataure in their language. Melchiades was the only one who really was concerned with him, as he made him listen to his incomprehensible texts and gave him lessons in the art of daguerreotype. No one imagined how much he wept in secret, and the desperation with which he tried to revive Melchiades with the useless study of his papers. The school, where they paid attention to him and respected him, and then power, with his endless decrees and his glorious uniform, freed him from the weight of an old bitterness. One night in Caterino's store, someone dared tell him, "You don't deserve the last name you carry." Contrary to what everyone expected, Arcadio did not have him shot. "To my great honor," he said, "I am not a Buendía." Those who knew the secret of his parentage thought that the answer meant that he too was aware of it, but he had really never been. Pilar Tenera, his mother, who had made his blood boil in the dark-room, was as much an irresistible obsession for him as she had been first for José Arcadio, and then for Aureliano. In spite of her having lost her charms and the splendor of her laugh, he sought her out and found her by the trail of her smell of smoke. A short time before the war, one noon when she was later than usual in coming for her younger son at school, Arcadio was waiting for her in the room where he was accustomed to take his siesta, and where he later set up the stocks. While the child played in the courtyard, he waited in his hammock, trembling with anxiety, knowing that Pilar Tenera would have to pass through there. She arrived. Arcadio grabbed her by the wrist and tried to pull her into the hammock. I can't. Pilar Tenera said in horror. "You can't imagine how much I would like to make you happy, but as God is my witness, I can't." Arcadio took her by the waist, with his tremendous hereditary strength, and he felt the world disappear with the contact of her skin. "Don't play the saint," he said. "After all, everybody knows that you're a whore." Pilar overcame the disgust that her miserable fate inspired in her. "The children will find out," she murmured. "It will be better if you leave the bar off the door tonight." Arcadio waited for her that night, trembling with fever in his hammock. He waited without sleeping, listening to the aroused crickets in the endless hours of early morning and the implacable telling of time by the curlews, more and more convinced that he had been deceived. Suddenly, when anxiety had broken down into rage, the door opened. A few months later, facing the firing squad, Arcadio would relive the wandering steps in the classroom, the stumbling against benches, and finally the bulk of a body in the shadows of the room, and the breathing of air that was pumped by a heart that was not his. He stretched out his hand and found another hand with 2 rings on the same finger about to go astray in the darkness. He felt the structure of the veins, the pulse of its misfortune, and felt the damp palm with a lifeline cut off at the base of the thumb by the claws of death. Then he realized that this was not the woman he was waiting for, because she did not smell of smoke, but of flower lotion, and she had inflated, blind breasts with nipples like a man's, a sex as stony and round as a nut, and the chaotic tenderness of excited inexperience. She was a virgin, and she had the unlikely name of Santa Sofia de la Piedad. Pilar Ternera had paid her 50 pesos, half of her life savings, to do what she was doing. Arcadio had seen her many times working in her parents' small food store, but he had never taken a good look at her, because she had that rare virtue of never existing completely except at the opportune moment. But from that day on he huddled like a cat in the warmth of her armpit. She would go to the school at siesta time with the consent of her parents, to whom Pilar Ternera had paid the other half of her savings. Later on, when the government troops dislodged them from the place where they had made love, they did it among the cans of lard and sacks of corn in the back of the store. About the time that Arcadio was named civil and military leader, they had a daughter. The only relatives who knew about it were José Arcadio and Rebecca, with whom Arcadio maintained close relations at that time, based not so much on kinship as on complicity. José Arcadio had put his neck into the marital yoke. Rebecca's firm character, the veracity of her stomach, her tenacious ambition, absorbed the tremendous energy of her husband, who had been changed from a lazy, woman-chasing man into an enormous work animal. They kept a clean and neat house. Rebecca would open it wide at dawn, and the wind from the graveyard would come in through the windows and go out through the doors to the yard, and leave the whitewashed walls and furniture tanned by the saltpetre of the dead. Her hunger for earth, the clock of her parents' bones, the impatience of her blood as it faced Pietro Crespi's passivity, were relegated to the attic of her memory. All day long she would embroider beside the window, withdrawn from the uneasiness of the war, until the ceramic pots would begin to vibrate in the cupboard, and she would get up to warm the meal, much before the appearance, first of the mangy hounds, and then of the colossus in leggings and spurs with a double-barreled shotgun, who sometimes carried a deer on his shoulder, and almost always a string of rabbits or wild ducks. One afternoon, at the beginning of his rule, Arcadio paid them a surprise visit. They had not seen him since they had left the house, but he seemed so friendly and familiar that they invited him to share the stew. Only when they were having coffee did Arcadio reveal the motive behind his visit. He had received a complaint against José Arcadio. It was said that he had begun by ploughing his own yard, and had gone straight ahead into neighboring lands, knocking down fences and buildings with his oxen until he took forcible possession of the best plots of land around. On the peasants, whom he had not despoiled because he was not interested in their lands, he levied a contribution which he collected every Saturday with his hunting dogs and his double-barreled shotgun. He did not deny it. He based his right on the fact that the usurped lands had been distributed by José Arcadio Buendía at the time of the founding, and he thought it possible to prove that his father had been crazy ever since that time, for he had disposed of a patrimony that really belonged to the family. It was an unnecessary allegation, because Arcadio had not come to do justice. He simply offered to set up a registry office so that José Arcadio could legalize his title to the usurped land, under the condition that he delegate to the local government the right to collect the contributions. They made an agreement. Years later, when Colonel Aureliano Buendía examined the titles to property, he found registered in his brother's name all of the land between the hill where his yard was, on up to the horizon, including the cemetery, and discovered that during the 11 months of his rule, Arcadio had collected not only the money of the contributions, but had also collected fees from people for the right to bury their dead in José Arcadio's land. It took Ursula several months to find out what was already public knowledge, because people hid it from her so as not to increase her suffering. At first she suspected it. "Arcadio is building a house," she confided with feigned pride to her husband, as she tried to put a spoonful of calabash syrup into his mouth. Nevertheless, she involuntarily sighed and said, "I don't know why, but all this has a bad smell to me." Later on, when she found out that Arcadio had not only built a house, but had ordered some Viennese furniture, she confirmed her suspicions that he was using public funds. "You're the shame of our family name," she shouted at him one Sunday after Mass, when she saw him in his new house playing cards with his officers. Arcadio paid no attention to her. Only then did Ursula know that he had a 6-month-old daughter, and that Santa Sofia de la Piedad, with whom he was living outside of marriage, was pregnant again. She decided to write to Colonel Aureliano Buendía, wherever he was, to bring him up to date on the situation. But the fast-moving events of those days not only prevented her plans from being carried out, they made her regret having conceived them. The war, which until then had been only a word to designate a vague and remote circumstance, became a concrete and dramatic reality. Around the end of February, an old woman with an ashen look arrived in Macondo riding a donkey loaded down with brooms. She seemed so inoffensive that the sentries let her pass without any question as another vendor, one of the many who often arrived from the towns in the swamp. She went directly to the barracks. Arcadio received her in the place where the classroom used to be, and which at that time had been transformed into a kind of rearguard encampment, with rolled hammocks hanging on hooks and mats piled up in the corners, and rifles and carbines and even hunting shotguns scattered on the floor. The old woman stiffened into a military salute before identifying herself. "I am Colonel Gregorio Stevenson." He brought bad news. The last centers of liberal resistance, according to what he said, were being wiped out. Colonel Aureliano Buendía, whom he had left fighting in retreat near Riohacha, had given him a message for Arcadio. He should surrender the town without resistance on the condition that the lives and property of liberals would be respected. Arcadio examined that strange messenger, who could have been a fugitive grandmother, with a look of pity. "You have brought something in writing, naturally," he said. "Naturally," the emissary answered. "I have brought nothing of the sort. It's easy to understand that under the present circumstances a person can't carry anything that would compromise him." As he was speaking, he reached into his bodice and took out a small gold fish. "I think that this will be sufficient," he said. Arcadio could see that indeed it was one of the little fishes made by Colonel Aureliano Buendía. But anyone could have bought it before the war, or stolen it, and it had no merit as a safe-conduct pass. The messenger even went to the extreme of violating a military secret so that they would believe his identity. He revealed that he was on a mission to Curaçao, where he hoped to recruit exiles from all over the Caribbean and acquire arms and supplies sufficient to attempt a landing at the end of the year. With faith in that plan, Colonel Aureliano Buendía was not in favor of any useless sacrifices at that time, but Arcadio was inflexible. He had the prisoner put into the stocks until he could prove his identity, and he resolved to defend the town to the death. He did not have long to wait. The news of the liberal defeat was more and more concrete. Toward the end of March, before a dawn of premature rain, the tense calm of the previous weeks was abruptly broken by the desperate sounds of a cornet and a cannon shot that knocked down the steeple of the church. Actually, Arcadio's decision to resist was madness. He had only 50 poorly armed men with a ration of 20 cartridges apiece. But among them, his former pupils, excited by the high-sounding proclamations, the determination reigned to sacrifice their skins for a lost cause. In the midst of the tramping of boots, contradictory commands, cannon shots that made the earth tremble, wild shooting, and the senseless sound of cornets, the supposed Colonel Stevenson managed to speak to Arcadio. "Don't let me undergo the indignity of dying in the stocks in these women's clothes," he said to him. "If I have to die, let me die fighting." He succeeded in convincing him. Arcadio ordered them to give him a weapon and 20 cartridges, and he left him with 5 men to defend headquarters, while he went off with his staff to head up the resistance. He did not get to the road to the swamp. The barricades had been broken, and the defenders were openly fighting in the streets, first until they used up their ration of rifle bullets, then with pistols against rifles, and finally hand to hand. With the imminence of defeat, some women went into the street armed with sticks and kitchen knives. In that confusion, Arcadio found Amaranta, who was looking for him like a madwoman in her nightgown, and with 2 old pistols that had belonged to José Arcadio Buendía. He gave his rifle to an officer who had been disarmed in the fight and escaped with Amaranta through a nearby street to take her home. Ursula was in the doorway waiting, indifferent to the cannon shots that had opened up a hole in the front of the house next door. The rain was letting up, but the streets were as slippery and as smooth as melted soap, and one had to guess distances in the darkness. Arcadio left Amaranta with Ursula, and made an attempt to face 2 soldiers, who had opened up with heavy firing from the corner. The old pistols that had been kept for many years in the bureau did not work. Protecting Arcadio with her body, Ursula tried to drag him toward the house. "Come along in the name of God!" she shouted at him. "There's been enough madness." The soldiers aimed at them. "Let go of that man, ma'am," one of them shouted. "Oh, we won't be responsible." Arcadio pushed Ursula toward the house and surrendered. A short time later, the shooting stopped and the bells began to toll. The resistance had been wiped out in less than half an hour. Not a single one of Arcadio's men had survived the attack, but before dying they had killed 300 soldiers. The last stronghold was the barracks. Before being attacked, the supposed Colonel Gregorio Stevenson had freed the prisoners and ordered his men to go out and fight in the street. The extraordinary mobility and accurate aim with which he placed his 20 cartridges gave the impression that the barracks was well defended, and the attackers blew it to pieces with cannon fire. The captain who directed the operation was startled to find the rubble deserted, and a single dead man in his undershorts, with an empty rifle still clutched in an arm that had been blown completely off. He had a woman's full head of hair held at the neck with a comb, and on his neck a chain with a small gold fish. When he turned him over with the tip of his boot and put the light on his face, the captain was perplexed. "Jesus Christ!" he exclaimed. Other officers came over. "Look where this fellow turned up," the captain said. "It's Gregorio Stevenson." At dawn, after a summary court-martial, Arcadio was shot against the wall of the cemetery. In the last 2 hours of his life he did not manage to understand why the fear that had tormented him since childhood had disappeared. Impassive, without even worrying about making a show of his recent bravery, he listened to the interminable charges of the accusation. He thought about Ursula, who at that hour must have been under the chestnut tree having coffee with José Arcadio Buendía. He thought about his 8-month-old daughter, who still had no name, and about the child who was going to be born in August. He thought about Santa Sofía de la Piedad, whom he had left the night before, salting down a deer for the next day's lunch, and he missed her hair pouring over her shoulders, and her eyelashes, which looked as if they were artificial. He thought about his people without sentimentality, with the strict closing of his accounts with life, beginning to understand how much he really loved the people he hated most. The president of the court-martial began his final speech when Arcadio realized that 2 hours had passed. "Even if the proven charges did not have merit enough," the president was saying, "the irresponsible and criminal boldness with which the accused drove his subordinates on to a useless death would be enough to deserve capital punishment." In the shattered schoolhouse, where for the first time he had felt the security of power, a few feet from the room where he had come to know the uncertainty of love, Arcadio found the formality of death ridiculous. Death really did not matter to him, but life did, and therefore the sensation he felt when they gave their decision was not a feeling of fear, but of nostalgia. He did not speak until they asked him for his last request. "Tell my wife," he answered in a well-modulated voice, "to give the girl the name of Ursula." He paused and said it again. "Ursula, like her grandmother, and tell her also that if the child that is to be born is a boy, they should name him José Arcadio, not for his uncle, but for his grandfather. Before they took him to the execution wall, Father Nicanor tried to attend him. "I have nothing to repent," Arcadio said, and he put himself under the orders of the squad after drinking a cup of black coffee. The leader of the squad, a specialist in summary executions, had a name that had much more about it than chance: Captain Roque Carnicero, which meant butcher. On the way to the cemetery, under the persistent drizzle, Arcadio saw that a radiant Wednesday was breaking out on the horizon. His nostalgia disappeared with the mist, and left an immense curiosity in its place. Only when they ordered him to put his back to the wall did Arcadio see Rebecca, with wet hair and a pink flowered dress, opening wide the door. He made an effort to get her to recognize him, and Rebecca did take a casual look toward the wall, and was paralyzed with stupor, barely able to react and wave goodbye to Arcadio. Arcadio answered her the same way. At that instant, the smoking mouths of the rifles were aimed at him, and letter by letter he heard the encyclicals that Melquiades had chanted, and he heard the lost steps of Santa Sofia de la Piedad, a virgin, in the classroom, and in his nose he felt the same icy hardness that had drawn his attention in the nostrils of the corpse of Remedios. "Oh, God damn it," he managed to think. "I forgot to say that if it was a girl, they should name her Remedios." Then, all accumulated in the rip of a claw, he felt again all the terror that had tormented him in his life. The captain gave the order to fire. Arcadio barely had time to put out his chest and raise his head, not understanding where the hot liquid that burned his thighs was pouring from. "Bastards!" he shouted. "Long live the Liberal Party!" The war was over in May. 2 weeks before the government made the official announcement in a high-sounding proclamation, which promised merciless punishment for those who had started the rebellion, Colonel Aureliano Buendía fell prisoner just as he was about to reach the western frontier, disguised as an Indian witch-doctor. Of the 21 men who had followed him to war, 14 fell in combat, 6 were wounded, and only 1 accompanied him at the moment of final defeat, Colonel Gabriel Márquez. The news of his capture was announced in Macondo with a special proclamation. "He's alive," Ursula told her husband. "Let's pray to God for his enemies to show him clemency." After 3 days of weeping, one afternoon, as she was stirring some sweet milk candy in the kitchen, she heard her son's voice clearly in her ear. "It was Aureliano," she shouted, running toward the chestnut tree to tell her husband the news. "I don't know how the miracle took place, but he's alive and we're going to see him very soon." She took it for granted. She had the floors of the house scrubbed and changed the position of the furniture. 1 week later, a rumor from somewhere that was not supported by any proclamation gave dramatic confirmation to the prediction. Colonel Aureliano Buendía had been condemned to death, and the sentence would be carried out in Macondo as a lesson to the population. One Monday, at 10:30 in the morning, Amaranta was dressing Aureliano José when she heard the sound of a distant troop and the blast of a cornet 1 second before Ursula burst into the room with the shout, "They're bringing him now!" The troop struggled to subdue the overflowing crowd with their rifle butts. Ursula and Amaranta ran to the corner, pushing their way through, and then they saw him. He looked like a beggar. His clothing was torn, his hair and beard were tangled, and he was barefoot. He was walking without feeling the burning dust, his hands tied behind his back with a rope that a mounted officer had attached to the head of his horse. Along with him, also ragged and defeated, they were bringing Colonel Gabriel Márquez. They were not sad. They seemed more disturbed by the crowd that was shouting all kinds of insults at the troops. "My son!" Ursula shouted in the midst of the uproar, and she slapped the soldier who tried to hold her back. The officer's horse reared. Then Colonel Aureliano Buendía stopped, tremulous, avoided the arms of his mother and fixed a stern look on her eyes. "Go home, Mama," he said. "Get permission from the authorities to come see me in jail." He looked at Amaranta, who stood indecisively 2 steps behind Ursula, and he smiled as he asked her, "What happened to your hand?" Amaranta raised the hand with the black bandage. "A burn," she said, and took Ursula away so that the horses would not run her down. The troop took off. A special guard surrounded the prisoners and took them to the jail at a trot. At dusk, Ursula visited Colonel Aureliano Buendía in jail. She had tried to get permission through Don Apolinar Moscote, but he had lost all authority in the face of the military omnipotence. Father Nicanor was in bed with hepatic fever. The parents of Colonel Hernaldo Márquez, who had not been condemned to death, had tried to see him and were driven off with rifle butts. Facing the impossibility of finding anyone to intervene, convinced that her son would be shot at dawn, Ursula wrapped up the things she wanted to bring him and went to the jail alone. "I am the mother of Colonel Aureliano Buendía," she announced. The sentries blocked her way. "I'm going in any case," Ursula warned them, "so if you have orders to shoot, start right in." She pushed one of them aside and went into the former classroom, where a group of half-dressed soldiers were oiling their weapons. An officer in a field uniform, ruddy-faced, with very thick glasses and ceremonious manners, signalled to the sentries to withdraw. "I am the mother of Colonel Aureliano Buendía," Ursula repeated. "You must mean," the officer corrected her with a friendly smile, "that you are the mother of Mr. Aureliano Buendía." Ursula recognized in his affected way of speaking the languid cadence of the stuck-up people from the Highlands. "As you say, Mr., she accepted, "just as long as I can see him." There were superior orders that prohibited visits to prisoners condemned to death, but the officer assumed the responsibility of letting her have a 15-minute stay. Ursula showed him what she had in the bundle, a change of clean clothing, the short boots that her son had worn at his wedding, and the sweet milk candy that she had kept for him since the day she had sensed his return. She found Colonel Aureliano Buendía in the room that was used as a cell, lying on a cot with his arms spread out, because his armpits were paved with sores. They had allowed him to shave. The thick mustache, with twisted ends, accentuated the sharp angles of his cheekbones. He looked paler to Ursula than when he had left, a little taller and more solitary than ever. He knew all about the details of the house, Pietro Crespi's suicide, Arcadio's arbitrary acts and execution, the dauntlessness of José Arcadio Buendía underneath the chestnut tree. He knew that Amaranta had consecrated her virginal widowhood to the rearing of Aureliano José, and that the latter was beginning to show signs of quite good judgment, and that he had learned to read and write at the same time he had learned to speak. From the moment in which she entered the room, Ursula felt inhibited by the maturity of her son, by his aura of command, by the glow of authority that radiated from his skin. She was surprised that he was so well informed. "You knew all along that I was a wizard," he joked, and he added in a serious tone, "This morning, when they brought me in, I had the impression that I had already been through all that before." In fact, while the crowd was roaring alongside him, he had been concentrating his thoughts, startled at how the town had aged. The leaves of the almond trees were broken. The houses, painted blue, then painted red, had ended up with an indefinable coloration. "What did you expect?" Ursula sighed. "Time passes." "That's how it goes," Aureliano admitted, "but not so much." In that way the long-awaited visit, for which both had prepared questions and had even anticipated answers, was once more the usual everyday conversation. When the guard announced the end of the visit, Aureliano took out a roll of sweaty papers from under the cot. They were his poetry, the poems inspired by Remedios, which he had taken with him when he left, and those he had written later on, during chance pauses in the war. "Promise me that no one will read them," he said. "Light the oven with them this very night." Ursula promised, and stood up to kiss him goodbye. "I brought you a revolver," she murmured. Colonel Aureliano Buendía saw that the sentry could not see. "It won't do me any good," he said in a low voice, "but give it to me in case they search you on the way out." Ursula took the revolver out of her bodice and put it under the mattress of the cot. "And don't say goodbye," He concluded with emphatic calmness. "Don't beg or bow down to anyone. Pretend that they shot me a long time ago." Ursula bit her lip so as not to cry. "Put some hot stones on those sores," she said. She turned halfway around and left the room. Colonel Aureliano Buendía remained standing, thoughtful, until the door closed. Then he lay down again with his arms open. Since the beginning of adolescence, when he had begun to be aware of his premonitions, he thought that death would be announced with a definite, unequivocal, irrevocable signal, but there were only a few hours left before he would die, and the signal had not come. On a certain occasion, a very beautiful woman had come into his camp in Tukarenka and asked the sentries permission to see him. They let her through because they were aware of the fanaticism of some mothers, who sent their daughters to the bedrooms of the most famous warriors, according to what they said, to improve the breed. That night Colonel Aureliano Buendía was finishing the poem about the man who is lost in the rain when the girl came into his room. He turned his back to her to put the sheet of paper into the locked drawer where he kept his poetry. And then he sensed it. He grasped the pistol in the drawer without turning his head. "Please don't shoot," he said. When he turned around, holding his pistol, the girl had lowered hers and did not know what to do. In that way he had avoided 4 out of 11 traps. On the other hand, someone who was never caught entered the revolutionary headquarters one night in Manaure and stabbed to death his close friend, Colonel Magnifico Bisbal, to whom he had given his cot so that he could sweat out a fever. A few yards away, sleeping in a hammock in the same room, he was not aware of anything. His efforts to systematize his premonitions were useless. They would come suddenly in a wave of supernatural lucidity, like an absolute and momentaneous conviction, but they could not be grasped. On occasion they were so natural that he identified them as premonitions only after they had been fulfilled. Frequently they were nothing but ordinary bits of superstition, but when they condemned him to death and asked him to state his last wish, he did not have the least difficulty in identifying the premonition that inspired his answer. "I ask that the sentence be carried out in Macondo," he said. The president of the court-martial was annoyed. "Don't be clever, Buendía," he told him. "That's just a trick to gain more time. If you don't fulfill it, that will be your worry," the colonel said. "But that's my last wish." Since then the premonitions had abandoned him. The day when Ursula visited him in jail, after a great deal of thinking, he came to the conclusion that perhaps death would not be announced that time, because it did not depend on chance, but on the will of his executioners. He spent the night awake, tormented by the pain of his sores. A little before dawn he heard steps in the hallway. "They're coming," he said to himself, and for no reason he thought of José Arcadio Buendía, who at that moment was thinking about him under the dreary dawn of the chestnut tree. He did not feel fear or nostalgia, but an intestinal rage at the idea that this artificial death would not let him see the end of so many things that he had left unfinished. The door opened, and a sentry came in with a mug of coffee. On the following day at the same hour he would still be doing what he was then, raging with the pain in his armpits, and the same thing happened. On Thursday he shared the sweet milk candy with the guards, and put on his clean clothes, which were tight for him, and the patent leather boots. By Friday they had still not shot him. Actually, they did not dare carry out the sentence. The rebelliousness of the town made the military men think that the execution of Colonel Aureliano Buendía might have serious political consequences not only in Macondo, but throughout the area of the swamp, so they consulted the authorities in the capital of the province. On Saturday night, while they were waiting for an answer, Captain Roque Carnicero went with some of the other officers to Caterino's place. Only one woman, practically threatened, dared take him to her room. "They don't want to go to bed with a man they know is going to die," she confessed to him. "No one knows how it will come, but everybody is going around saying that the officer who shoots Colonel Aureliano Buendía and all the soldiers in the squad, one by one, will be murdered with no escape, sooner or later, even if they hide at the ends of the earth." Captain Roque Carnicero mentioned it to the other officers, and they told their superiors. On Sunday, although no one had revealed it openly, Although no action on the part of the military had disturbed the tense calm of those days, the whole town knew that the officers were ready to use any manner of pretext to avoid responsibility for the execution. The official order arrived in the Monday mail. The execution was to be carried out within 24 hours. That night, the officers put 7 slips of paper into a cap, and Captain Roque Carnicero's unpeaceful fate was foreseen by his name on the prize slip. "Bad luck doesn't have any chinks in it," he said with deep bitterness. "I was born a son of a bitch, and I'm going to die a son of a bitch." At 5 in the morning he chose the squad by lot, formed it in the courtyard, and woke up the condemned man with a premonitory phrase. "Let's go, Buendía," he told him. "Our time has come." "So that's what it was," the colonel replied. "I was dreaming that my sores had burst." Rebecca Buendía got up at 3 in the morning when she learned that Aureliano would be shot. She stayed in the bedroom in the dark, watching the cemetery wall through the half-opened window, as the bed on which she sat shook with José Arcadio's snoring. She had waited all week with the same hidden persistence with which, during different times, she had waited for Pietro Crespi's letters. "They won't shoot him here," José Arcadio told her. "They'll shoot him at midnight in the barracks so that no one will know who made up the squad, and they'll bury him right there." Rebecca kept on waiting. "They're stupid enough to shoot him here," she said. She was so certain that she had foreseen the way she would open the door to wave goodbye. "They won't bring him through the streets," José Arcadio insisted, "with 6 scared soldiers and knowing that the people are ready for anything." Indifferent to her husband's logic, Rebecca stayed by the window. "You'll see that they're just stupid enough," she said. On Tuesday, at 5 in the morning, José Arcadio had drunk his coffee and let the dogs out, when Rebecca closed the window and held on to the head of the bed so as not to fall down. They're bringing him," she sighed. "He's so handsome." José Arcadio looked out the window and saw him, tremulous in the light of dawn. He already had his back to the wall and his hands were on his hips, because the burning knots in his armpits would not let him lower them. "A person fucks himself up so much," Colonel Aureliano Buendía said. "Fucks himself up so much, just so that 6 weak fairies can kill him, and he can't do anything about it." He repeated it with so much rage that it almost seemed to be fervor, and Captain Roque Carnicero was touched, because he thought he was praying. When the squad took aim, the rage had materialized into a viscous and bitter substance that put his tongue to sleep and made him close his eyes. Then the aluminum glow of dawn disappeared, and he saw himself again in short pants, wearing a tie around his neck, and he saw his father leading him into the tent on a splendid afternoon, and he saw the ice. When he heard the shout, he thought that it was the final command to the squad. He opened his eyes with a shudder of curiosity, expecting to meet the incandescent trajectory of the bullets. But he only saw Captain Roque Carnicero with his arms in the air, and José Arcadio crossing the street with his fearsome shotgun ready to go off. "Don't shoot," the captain said to José Arcadio. "You were sent by divine providence." Another war began right there. Captain Roque Carnicero and his 6 men left with Colonel Aureliano Buendía to free the revolutionary general Victorio Medina, who had been condemned to death in Riohacha. They thought they could save time by crossing the mountains along the trail that José Arcadio Buendía had followed to found Macondo, but before a week was out, they were convinced that it was an impossible undertaking. So they had to follow the dangerous route over the outcroppings, with no other munitions but what the firing squad had. They would camp near the towns, and one of them, with a small gold fish in his hand, would go in disguise in broad daylight to contact the dormant liberals, who would go out hunting on the following morning and never return. When they saw Riohacha from a ridge in the mountains, General Vittorio Medina had been shot. Colonel Aureliano Buendía's men proclaimed him chief of the revolutionary forces of the Caribbean coast with the rank of general. He assumed the position, but refused the promotion, and took the stand that he would never accept it as long as the conservative regime was in power. At the end of 3 months they had succeeded in arming more than 1,000 men, but they were wiped out. The survivors reached the eastern frontier. The next thing that was heard of them was that they had landed on Cabo de la Vela, coming from the smaller islands of the Antilles, and a message from the government was sent all over by telegraph and included in jubilant proclamations throughout the country announcing the death of Colonel Aureliano Buendía. But 2 days later, a multiple telegram, which almost overtook the previous one, announced another uprising on the southern plains. That was how the legend of the ubiquitous Colonel Aureliano Buendía began. Simultaneous and contradictory information declared him victorious in Villanueva, defeated in Guacamayal, devoured by Motilon Indians, dead in a village in the swamp, and up in arms again in Urumita. The liberal leaders, who at that moment were negotiating for participation in the Congress, branded him an adventurer who did not represent the party. The national government placed him in the category of a bandit and put a price of 5,000 pesos on his head. After 16 defeats, Colonel Aureliano Buendía left Guajira with 2,000 well-armed Indians, and the garrison, which was taken by surprise as it slept, abandoned Riohacha. He established his headquarters there and proclaimed total war against the regime. The first message he received from the government was a threat to shoot Colonel Gabriel Márquez within 48 hours if he did not withdraw with his forces to the eastern frontier. Colonel Roque Carnicero, who was his chief of staff then, gave him the telegram with a look of consternation, but he read it with unforeseen joy. "How wonderful!" he exclaimed. "We have a telegraph office in Macondo now." His reply was definitive. In 3 months he expected to establish his headquarters in Macondo. If he did not find Colonel Gabriel Márquez alive at that time, he would shoot out of hand all of the officers he held prisoner at that moment, starting with the generals, and he would give orders to his subordinates to do the same for the rest of the war. 3 months later, when he entered Macondo in triumph, the first embrace he received on the swamp road was that of Colonel Gabriel Márquez. The house was full of children. Ursula had taken in Santa Sofia de la Piedad with her older daughter and a pair of twins, who had been born 5 months after Arcadio had been shot. Contrary to the victim's last wishes, she baptized the girl with the name Remedios. "I'm sure that was what Arcadio meant," she alleged. "We won't call her Ursula, because a person suffers too much with that name." The twins were named José Arcadio II and Aureliano II. Amaranta took care of them all. She put small wooden chairs in the living room and established a nursery with other children from neighboring families. When Colonel Aureliano Buendía returned in the midst of exploding rockets and ringing bells, a children's chorus welcomed him to the house. Aureliano José, tall like his grandfather, dressed as a revolutionary officer, gave him military honors. Not all the news was good. A year after the flight of Colonel Aureliano Buendía, José Arcadio and Rebecca went to live in the house Arcadio had built. No one knew about his intervention to halt the execution. In the new house, located on the best corner of the square, in the shade of an almond tree that was honored by 3 nests of redbreasts, with a large door for visitors and 4 windows for light, they set up a hospitable home. Rebecca's old friends, among them 4 of the Moscote sisters who were still single, once more took up the sessions of embroidery that had been interrupted years before on the porch with the begonias. José Arcadio continued to profit from the usurped lands, the title to which was recognized by the conservative government. Every afternoon he could be seen returning on horseback, with his hunting dogs and his double-barreled shotgun and a string of rabbits hanging from his saddle. One September afternoon, with the threat of a storm, he returned home earlier than usual. He greeted Rebecca in the dining room, tied the dogs up in the courtyard, hung the rabbits up in the kitchen to be salted later, and went to the bedroom to change his clothes. Rebecca later declared that when her husband went into the bedroom, she was locked in the bathroom and did not hear anything. It was a difficult version to believe, but there was no other more plausible, and no one could think of any motive for Rebecca to murder the man who had made her happy. That was perhaps the only mystery that was never cleared up in Macondo. As soon as José Arcadio closed the bedroom door, the sound of a pistol shot echoed through the house. A trickle of blood came out under the door, crossed the living room, went out into the street, continued on in a straight line across the uneven terraces, went down steps and climbed over curbs, passed along the Street of the Turks, turned a corner to the right and another to the left, made a right angle at the Buendía house, went in under the closed door, crossed through the parlour, hugging the walls so as not to stain the rugs, went on to the other living room, made a wide curve to avoid the dining-room table, went along the porch with the begonias, and passed without being seen under Amaranta's chair as she gave an arithmetic lesson to Aureliano José, and went through the pantry and came out in the kitchen, where Ursula was getting ready to crack 36 eggs to make bread. "Holy Mother of God!" Ursula shouted. She followed the thread of blood back along its course, and in search of its origin she went through the pantry, along the begonia porch, where Aureliano José was chanting that 3 + 3 is 6, and 6 + 3 is 9, and she crossed the dining room and the living rooms, and followed straight down the street, and she turned first to the right and then to the left, to the Street of the Turks, forgetting that she was still wearing her baking apron and her house slippers, and she came out onto the square and went into the door of a house where she had never been, and she pushed open the bedroom door, and was almost suffocated by the smell of burned gunpowder, and she found José Arcadio lying face down on the ground on top of the leggings he had just taken off, and she saw the starting point of the thread of blood that had already stopped flowing out of his right ear. They found no wound on his body, nor could they locate the weapon, nor was it possible to remove the smell of powder from the corpse. First they washed him 3 times with soap and a scrubbing brush, then they rubbed him with salt and vinegar, then with ashes and lemon, and finally they put him in a barrel of lye and let him stay for 6 hours. They scrubbed him so much that the arabesques of his tattooing began to fade. When they thought of the desperate measure of seasoning him with pepper, cumin seeds, and laurel leaves, and boiling him for a whole day over a slow fire, he had already begun to decompose, and they had to bury him hastily. They sealed him hermetically in a special coffin 7.5 feet long and 4 feet wide, reinforced inside with iron plates, and fastened together with steel bolts, and even then the smell could be perceived on the streets through which the funeral procession passed. Father Nicanor, with his liver enlarged and tight as a drum, gave him his blessing from bed. Although in the months that followed they reinforced the grave with walls about it, between which they threw compressed ash, sawdust, and quicklime, the cemetery still smelled of powder for many years after, until the engineers from the Banana Company covered the grave over with a shell of concrete. As soon as they took the body out, Rebecca closed the doors of her house and buried herself alive, covered with a thick crust of disdain that no earthly temptation was ever able to break. She went out into the street on one occasion, when she was very old, with shoes the colour of old silver, and a hat made of tiny flowers, during the time that the wandering Jew passed through town, and brought on a heat wave that was so intense that birds broke through window screens to come to die in the bedrooms. The last time anyone saw her alive was when, with one shot, she killed a thief who was trying to force the door of her house. Except for Argenida, her servant and confidant, no one ever had any more contact with her after that. At one time it was discovered that she was writing letters to the bishop, whom she claimed as a first cousin, but it was never said whether she received any reply. The town forgot about her. In spite of his triumphal return, Colonel Aureliano Buendía was not enthusiastic over the looks of things. The government troops abandoned their positions without resistance, and that aroused an illusion of victory among the liberal population that it was not right to destroy. But the revolutionaries knew the truth, Colonel Aureliano Buendía better than any of them. Although at that moment he had more than 5,000 men under his command, and held 2 coastal states, he had the feeling of being hemmed in against the sea, and caught in a situation that was so confused that when he ordered the restoration of the church steeple, which had been knocked down by army cannon fire, Father Nicanor commented from his sickbed, "This is silly. The defenders of the faith of Christ destroy the church, and the masons order it rebuilt." Looking for a loophole through which he could escape, he spent hours on end in the telegraph office, conferring with the commanders of other towns, and every time he would emerge with the firmest impression that the war was at a stalemate. When news of fresh liberal victories was received, it was celebrated with jubilant proclamations, but he would measure the real extent of them on the map, and could see that his forces were penetrating into the jungle, defending themselves against malaria and mosquitoes, advancing in the opposite direction from reality. "We're wasting time," he would complain to his officers. "We're wasting time while the bastards in the party are begging for seats in Congress." Lying awake at night, stretched out on his back in a hammock in the same room where he had awaited death, he would evoke the image of lawyers dressed in black, leaving the presidential palace in the icy cold of early morning, with their coat collars turned up about their ears, rubbing their hands, whispering, taking refuge in dreary early morning cafes, to speculate over what the president had meant when he said yes, or what he had meant when he said no, and even to imagine what the president was thinking when he said something quite different, as he chased away mosquitoes at a temperature of 95 degrees, feeling the approach of the fearsome dawn, when he would have to give his men the command to jump into the sea. One night of uncertainty, when Pilar Ternera was singing in the courtyard with the soldiers, he asked her to read the future in her cards. "Watch out for your mouth," was all that Pilar Ternera brought out after spreading and picking up the cards 3 times. "I don't know what it means, but the sign is very clear. Watch out for your mouth." 2 days later, someone gave an orderly a mug of black coffee, and the orderly passed it on to someone else, and that one to someone else, until, hand to hand, it reached Colonel Aureliano Buendia's office. He had not asked for any coffee, but since it was there, the colonel drank it. It had a dose of nux vomica, strong enough to kill a horse. When they took him home, he was stiff and arched, and his tongue was sticking out between his teeth. Ursula fought against death over him. After cleaning out his stomach with emetics, she wrapped him in hot blankets and fed him egg whites for 2 days, until his harrowed body recovered its normal temperature. On the 4th day he was out of danger. Against his will, pressured by Ursula and his officers, he stayed in bed for another week. Only then did he learn that his verses had not been burned. "I didn't want to be hasty," Ursula explained to him. "That night when I went to light the oven, I said to myself that it would be better to wait until they brought the body." In the haze of convalescence, surrounded by Remedios' dusty dolls, Colonel Aureliano Buendia brought back the decisive periods of his existence by reading his poetry. He started writing again. For many hours, balancing on the edge of the surprises of a war with no future, in rhymed verse, he resolved his experience on the shores of death. Then his thoughts became so clear that he was able to examine them forward and backward. One night he asked Colonel Herineldo Marquez, "Tell me something, old friend. Why are you fighting?" "What other reason could there be?" Colonel Herineldo Marquez answered, "For the great Liberal Party." "You're lucky because you know why," he answered. "As far as I'm concerned, I've come to realize only just now that I'm fighting because of pride." "That's bad," Colonel Herineldo Marquez said. Colonel Aureliano Buendia was amused at his alarm. "Naturally," he said, "but in any case, it's better than not knowing why you're fighting." He looked him in the eyes and added with a smile, "Or fighting, like you, for something that doesn't have any meaning for anyone." His pride had prevented him from making contact with the armed groups in the interior of the country, until the leaders of the party publicly rectified their declaration that he was a bandit. He knew, however, that as soon as he put those scruples aside, he would break the vicious circle of the war. Convalescence gave him time to reflect. Then he succeeded in getting Ursula to give him the rest of her buried inheritance and her substantial savings. He named Colonel Herineldo Marquez civil and military leader of Macondo, and he went off to make contact with the rebel groups in the interior. Colonel Herineldo Marquez was not only the man closest to Colonel Aureliano Buendia, but Ursula received him as a member of the family. Fragile, timid, with natural good manners, he was, however, better suited for war than for government. His political advisers easily entangled him in theoretical labyrinths, but he succeeded in giving Macondo the atmosphere of rural peace that Colonel Aureliano Buendia dreamed of, so that he could die of old age making little gold fishes. Although he lived in his parents' house, he would have lunch at Ursula's 2 or 3 times a week. He initiated Aureliano José in the use of firearms, gave him early military instruction, and for several months took him to live in the barracks, with Ursula's consent, so that he could become a man. Many years before, when he was still almost a child, Reinaldo Marquez had declared his love for Amaranta. At that time she was so illusioned with her lonely passion for Pietro Crespi that she laughed at him. Reinaldo Marquez waited. On a certain occasion he sent Amaranta a note from jail, asking her to embroider a dozen batiste handkerchiefs with his father's initials on them. He sent her the money. A week later, Amaranta brought the dozen handkerchiefs to him in jail, along with the money, and they spent several hours talking about the past. "When I get out of here, I'm going to marry you," Reinaldo Marquez told her when she left. Amaranta laughed, but she kept on thinking about him while she taught the children to read, and she tried to revive her juvenile passion for Pietro Crespi. On Saturdays, visiting days for the prisoners, she would stop by the house of Reinaldo Marquez's parents and accompany them to the jail. On one of those Saturdays, Ursula was surprised to see her in the kitchen, waiting for the biscuits to come out of the oven, so that she could pick the best ones and wrap them in a napkin that she had embroidered for the occasion. "Marry him," she told her. "You'll have a hard time finding another man like him." Amaranta feigned a reaction of displeasure. "I don't have to go around hunting for men," she answered. "I'm taking these biscuits to Reinaldo because I'm sorry that sooner or later they're going to shoot him." She said it without thinking, but that was the time that the government had announced its threat to shoot Colonel Reinaldo Marquez if the rebel forces did not surrender Riohacha. The visit stopped. Amaranta shut herself up to weep, overwhelmed by a feeling of guilt similar to the one that had tormented her when Remedios died, as if once more her careless words had been responsible for her death. Her mother consoled her. She assured her that Colonel Aureliano Buendía would do something to prevent the execution, and promised that she would take charge of attracting Reinaldo Marquez herself when the war was over. She fulfilled her promise before the imagined time. When Reinaldo Marquez returned to the house, invested with his new dignity of civil and military leader, she received him as a son, thought of delightful bits of flattery to hold him there, and prayed with all her soul that he would remember his plan to marry Amaranta. Her pleas seemed to be answered. On the days that he would have lunch at the house, Colonel Reinaldo Marquez would linger on the begonia porch playing Chinese checkers with Amaranta. Ursula would bring them coffee and milk and biscuits, and would take over the children so that they would not bother them. Amaranta was really making an effort to kindle in her heart the forgotten ashes of her youthful passion. With an anxiety that came to be intolerable, she waited for the lunch days, the afternoons of Chinese checkers, and time flew by in the company of the warrior with a nostalgic name, whose fingers trembled imperceptibly as he moved the pieces. But the day on which Colonel Reinaldo Marquez repeated his wish to marry her, she rejected him. "I'm not going to marry anyone," she told him, "much less you. You love Aureliano so much that you want to marry me because you can't marry him." Colonel Reinaldo Marquez was a patient man. "I'll keep on insisting," he said. "Sooner or later I'll convince you." He kept on visiting the house. Shut up in her bedroom, biting back her secret tears, Amaranta put her fingers in her ears so as not to hear the voice of the suitor as he gave Ursula the latest war news, and in spite of the fact that she was dying to see him, she had the strength not to go out and meet him. At that time, Colonel Aureliano Buendía took the time to send a detailed account to Macondo every 2 weeks, but only once, almost 8 months after he had left, did he write to Ursula. A special messenger brought a sealed envelope to the house with a sheet of paper inside bearing the colonel's delicate hand. "Take good care of Papa, because he is going to die." Ursula became alarmed. "If Aureliano says so, it's because Aureliano knows," she said, and she had them help her take José Arcadio Buendía to his bedroom. Not only was he as heavy as ever, but during his prolonged stay under the chestnut tree, he had developed the faculty of being able to increase his weight at will, to such a degree that 7 men were unable to lift him, and they had to drag him to the bed. A smell of tender mushrooms, of wood-flower fungus, of old and concentrated outdoors, impregnated the air of the bedroom as it was breathed by the colossal old man, weather-beaten by the sun and the rain. The next morning he was not in his bed. In spite of his undiminished strength, José Arcadio Buendía was in no condition to resist. It was all the same to him. If he went back to the chestnut tree, it was not because he wanted to, but because of a habit of his body. Ursula took care of him, fed him, brought him news of Aureliano. But actually the only person with whom he was able to have contact for a long time was Prudencio Aguilar. Almost pulverized at that time by the decrepitude of death, Prudencio Aguilar would come twice a day to chat with him. They talked about fighting cocks. They promised each other to set up a breeding farm for magnificent birds, not so much to enjoy their victories, which they would not need then, as to have something to do on the tedious Sundays of death. It was Prudencio Aguilar who cleaned him, fed him, and brought him splendid news of an unknown person called Aureliano, who was a colonel in the war. When he was alone, José Arcadio Buendía consoled himself with the dream of the infinite rooms. He dreamed that he was getting out of bed, opening the door, and going into an identical room with the same bed, with a wrought-iron head, the same wicker chair, and the same small picture of the Virgin of Help on the back wall. From that room he would go into another that was just the same, the door of which would open into another that was just the same, the door of which would open into another one just the same, and then into another exactly alike, and so on to infinity. He liked to go from room to room, as in a gallery of parallel mirrors, until Prudencio Aguilar would touch him on the shoulder. Then he would go back from room to room, walking in reverse, going back over his trail, and he would find Prudencio Aguilar in the room of reality. But one night, 2 weeks after they took him to his bed, Prudencio Aguilar touched his shoulder in an intermediate room, and he stayed there forever, thinking that it was the real room. On the following morning, Ursula was bringing him his breakfast when she saw a man coming along the hall. He was short and stocky, with a black suit on and a hat that was also black, enormous, pulled down to his taciturn eyes. "Good Lord," Ursula thought, "I could have sworn it was Melquiades." It was Cataure, Visitacion's brother, who had left the house fleeing from the insomnia plague, and of whom there had never been any news. Visitacion asked him why he had come back, and he answered her in their solemn language, "I have come for the exequies of the king." Then they went into José Arcadio Buendía's room, shook him as hard as they could, shouted in his ear, put a mirror in front of his nostrils, but they could not awaken him. A short time later, when the carpenter was taking measurements for the coffin, through the window they saw a light rain of tiny yellow flowers falling. They fell on the town all through the night in a silent storm, and they covered the roofs, and blocked the doors, and smothered the animals who slept outdoors. So many flowers fell from the sky that in the morning the streets were carpeted with a compact cushion, and they had to clear them away with shovels and rakes, so that the funeral procession could pass by.